Hey, thanks for everyone for coming today. This is a kind of a new direction for Risk New Zealand, having more engagement with the webinars. This was Ben's idea, Ben Lynch from our board. Also, I've got Regan Smith, our chair, here today. And so Ben is going to keep this pretty casual, talk about, as he said, share and discuss climate-related disclosures, see what's coming around from different kind of areas in New Zealand and different organisations, and so other people can kind of learn from it and go from there and also have a good discussion. So no more from me. Over to Ben, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, David. So yeah, welcome everyone, and it's quite nice we've got a smallish group today. It's always interesting, and when you're trying to run a discussion type session, the balance between too many people and too few people. So thank you for joining, and I appreciate your time. So as mentioned by David, yeah, this is a kind of new approach where we're recognizing, the what people have been through in terms of developing their climate related disclosures, and we're keen to get a view and discuss, how you went about doing this, what were the challenges, what are the opportunities, and from that form a bit of a best practice view that Risk New Zealand can then share with members and and others can get value from it. So some of the goals for today's session are develops thought leadership emerging from practice from the FY24 climate related disclosures. Secondly, develop insights for potential challenges for FY25, and with that, opportunities for Risk New Zealand to provide guidance and assistance to help overcome some of those challenges. And thirdly, there's a nice collection of people on the call today, so it's an opportunity to connect with your peers. Maybe you hear something interesting, and you can connect with others around exploring some concepts further, or just making friends and developing your risk network. So I thought, I've got a pretty loose agenda for today, and I thought, how we would do it would firstly, you know, give you the opportunity if you had any direct questions or directions you'd like to take the conversation, please put them in the chat, and we can go down that route, or put them in the chat, or put them in the Q&A, and if not, I'll put up a bit of a brief agenda that we could go through today. So people viewing the screen at the moment?
Yes.
Yep, that's fine.
Yep. Yeah, so I guess here's some ideas of thought uh, agenda that we could cover today. And it's good to remember that all ideas are good ideas. Everything you've done is good. And we're here just to share and ask questions and learn from each other. So I think firstly, we broke it down into 5 categories. Firstly, the role of risk in climate related disclosures, uh, how you approach the climate risk assessment, adaptation planning, how's that going? How well climate risk is integrated in the kind of wider risk management system, and have you considered nature risk? So I'll take this off the screen and then open up, I guess, a bit of a conversation around what role the risk team has played in the climate related disclosures, and also, once again, if you have any other views in terms of questions you'd like, please put them in the chat and we can talk about those too. So I guess I'll kick off my experiences and then we can go around the room. So I work for Fonterra, and as part of my role here, one of the big areas of work for the last financial year was assisting in the risk assessment, and that was quite a resource heavy task, and it was very interesting to work so collaboratively with the sustainability team to produce the climate related disclosures, which Fonterra is actually releasing in a week or two to the public. What I found really interesting is I guess my role. It was more in the risk assessment and the category on risk management than it was in the disclosure as a whole, or than it was in kind of the traditional carbon emission side of things. Yeah. How about anyone else? What was kind of your role, and or the role of risk in the climate-related disclosures for this year?
I can jump in and start,
Yeah.
which is we at Hastings Council are not currently required to do climate disclosures, but it is something that I guess we are conscious will probably come. And so between myself and one of the accountants from upstairs who pulls together the annual report, we've sort of had discussions around it, but I guess this is why I'm sort of joining in because I don't really know what it looks like if we do have to start doing them. We do now have a climate action officer in place here, which is helpful and hopefully will sort of support when we do need to do that. But yeah, I keen to hear what other places are doing because I can see it being on our horizon soon.
Thank you. I guess how about the others on the call? Did you produce a disclosure this year, or is it kind of a more preparing for future disclosures?
I can jump in, probably similar to what I just mentioned. Auckland Council have prepared a disclosure, which thankfully their Treasury team do most of the drafting of the actual disclosure, and we contribute our GHG info, which we've got a sustainability team at Watercare who prepare that, and then myself on the risk side led the charge on the climate-related risk contribution, both our contribution to the group level risks for Auckland Council and starting the detailed assessment of our entity level risks. I guess main challenge with the entity level risks is how granular do you go with the risks, and yeah, I think we started Tonkin and Taylor originally identified 78 climate related risks for Watercare. And when faced with the prospect of doing the detailed assessment on 78, we kind of very quickly said no. There's three things we're concerned about: drought, extreme weather events, sea level rise. And so for each of those three items or hazards, we picked kind of our three key risks. And then we had an additional sort of three top transition risks that we identified on top of those physical risks. And then that's what we'll be diving into over the next few months to complete the detailed assessment on.
Okay.
But definitely the collaboration was a huge part of it. So I can't imagine doing that as well as the GHG work that was done between finance and our sustainability people. Then of course we had the luxury of having the additional support of Council Treasury. And then obviously there's a point where the comms teams get involved as well to actually present all this information and make it palatable to human beings or to the primary users that will hopefully eventually be using it. So I think collaboration across all sorts of business units was definitely a key takeaway. Something that was quite important.
So just picking up on that Treasury doing base level, what sort of...
I can hear someone talking very faintly.
Sorry, I got my microphone in the wrong place.
All right.
So just in terms of the base level information Treasury's pulling together, have they had to build in additional structures to get the non-financial reporting information, or are they still just focused on financial?
So it's Auckland Council's Treasury that we're doing it, so a bit of a degree of separation from us, being kind of in a different building, different org, but they were pulling together beyond just financial everything for the disclosure and producing the final product, and that included information from obviously we're Watercare, the water supplier, but then also Auckland Transport, Ports of Auckland, and the other smaller CCOs as well. So a bit of a task for them.
Yeah, that's pretty big, eh? I don't suppose you've got any insight to what additional systems they needed to put in place to get that information, or business
so
reporting
probably
tools?
There was a group climate risk specialist hired at council to kind of coordinate the risk side of it between all of us CCOs to make sure we had some sort of consistency across the way we were assessing our climate related risks. Beyond that, what other systems or people the actual Treasury team had dedicated to this. I'm not too sure.
That's cool.
But there were, whenever we caught up with Council Treasury, there'd be 3 or 4 of them working towards the disclosure that would come and meet with us. So they had a chunk of resource pulling together the final product.
Yeah, and I found that quite new as well. Like not only communicating and collaborating with sustainability, but communicating and collaborating with the Treasury or whoever traditionally puts together a financial statement. Yeah, it was quite different to what I've experienced in risk before.
Which is kind of great. You know, it's throughout a lot of the conversations we had that started with climate-related risk, there'd be little side detours all over the show that were conversations that may not have happened otherwise, just other risk conversations with various business units, which helped our sort of day-to-day risk management and activities.
Yeah, I imagine it would do actually. Having those conversations, obviously the key part. We're using different reporting as a way of trying to get in amongst some of the delivery teams and talk risk with them. So I can see how this will be a big lever.
Yes. Yeah, and I don't know if we have various pockets amongst Watercare just because of the size and complexity of the organisation, whether it be within our infrastructure delivery or you know, operational sites and so on. You always come across the odd business unit manager who will go, you know, oh, I'm managing risk every day. I don't need to talk to you people, you know, like, and then it kind of helps having a regulated activity like this where it's like, well, no, we just have to work together on it. And then all of a sudden you start to get into other little pockets.
Yeah.
Yeah, are these themes similar for others, or was there something else? Was the risk team lumped with a lot more of the responsibility than the sustainability team, for example? Or yeah, go ahead.
Yes, so Daniel, my name's Dan Callahan from MAS. I guess we have a slightly different angle in that we for reporting purposes, a fund manager. Fund managers have their own sort of unique issues, primarily being that we're essentially required to aggregate up all our holdings, which could be 1,000 to 2,000 different securities across cash, fixed interest, equities. And so I guess to try and make it more relevant for the audience, there are probably some similarities in what we need to do around particularly the risk section and potentially the strategy sections of the reporting. Risk's role really falls into, I guess, a key link with the governance part of the business. So one thing that we were involved in and need to continually be involved in is just ensuring that the boards are educated and understand what climate-related disclosures and the reporting and the data and the monitoring requirements are from a governance perspective. So you need to take your board on a bit of a journey and make sure that you're upskilling them as you go along. For us, we don't have a sustainability team, so it's quite cross-functional in terms of the team that was involved in putting the statements together. So just making sure that there's people involved from, I mean, our team really went across risk, finance, and sort of specific compliance and product management functions in the funds management space. But really from a risk perspective, I think there's a really interesting question on your sort of agenda slide, which is really about where does climate risk fit into your sort of more broad enterprise risk framework, and that's a really interesting question because fundamentally we treat risk at an enterprise level, but we've been driven down this pathway from a regulatory sense of needing to become quite granular in how we look at some specific risks. So risks around climate change, risk around cyber, risk around sort of other things that regulators become interested in, and it's really helpful to try and pull it back to that enterprise level and look at it with a similar framework. And what you don't want to end up doing is ending up going down this route where you start treating particular risk types, such as climate change, differently to how you look at any other risk in your business. So just keeping that lens of saying, okay, what do we do with climate change? How do we consider that in terms of our overarching enterprise risk management strategy, and how to ensure we're not just ticking the boxes, but critically involving those sort of governance bodies and making sure we're addressing all the issues that need to be addressed is probably some of the challenges that we were thinking about in the preparation from a risk sense. So.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That's very. I guess that's a nice segue into that topic really around, how integrated is your climate risk? And I know from my perspective, we're at the early stages of integrating it, and even asking ourselves the question, is climate risk a separate risk, or is it inherent in kind of every other risk? And it's that kind of fundamental view on your risk management framework and as a whole versus what the regulation is saying. So, however other people kind of tackled the integration of climate risk into the enterprise risk management framework, and how is it going?
I guess I would say, oh, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry, you go.
I was going to say, well, as a council, we're with Hastings District Council, we always try to make sure that the enterprise risks are reflected in what teams are doing. That's quite hard, but the enterprise risk does stand as its own challenge to recognise at the council table that there's something that they need to respond to, and as a result, something that needs to have resources allocated, or time and effort or money allocated to. So we do have climate adaptation as opposed to, say, climate risk generally on our strategic risk register at the council level, which is more just to give visibility to what's going on. But any of the response activities end up being more mitigation approach, and they're just embedded into how different teams are managing their work areas. That's the ideal. Some parts of the business do better than others. Some parts that are regulated, like land use planning, building consenting, kind of already sort of constrained in terms of how far they can go. They're supposed to look at natural hazards. One of the challenges now is what's the future of some of that natural hazard, and so how much can you use future view as opposed to current knowledge of a hazard, so like flooding. So there's a bit more discussion now starting to happen awareness wise of, well, climate risk will manifest itself in terms of changes that affect the delivery of our services. So how are we adapting those services? The mitigation side of it, we haven't got as much of a strong focus, apart from doing a climate risk assessment, carbon assessment, and trying to plan where we can to have a carbon reduction plan. But I think at council we've sort of recognised the bigger problem is if we don't adapt, that'll have the biggest consequence for us.
Have you put it into, I guess, your risk matrix or your risk appetite statements, climate explicitly?
Not really. It doesn't. There's an environment impact in the risk framework, but not a climate change one. That would be a good idea. And in the risk appetite statements, not so much there either. And so thinking about how those tools can leverage that is a good idea.
Yeah, we were in the same boat in our sort of like our consequence scoring and our risk management framework. We always had environment, an environment section in there, but we didn't have. When I was going through it with Auckland Transport, they had both an environment and a climate section. You know, which seems quite smart. I think we've got a little bit in our risk appetite statement about it, but probably not a great deal. Similarly, we have always had climate related risks on our enterprise risk report, and you know, the long-term strategic planning team take into account a lot of climate data for their day-to-day work. But then how, perhaps, if we're going to up our game with our new set of climate-related risks for the disclosure, how they get integrated and align with that is a fun little challenge.
How about others on the call? How have you kind of thought to include climate into your enterprise risk framework?
For us, so I'm at Callaghan Innovation. We have climate risk as part of the broader sort of environment risk profile, because it's obviously, like, given we're currently subject to the carbon neutral government program and things like that, we have those types of obligations and things to care about. I mean, the challenge with a lot of this stuff and having it prioritized at an enterprise risk level is always it can feel very far off to a lot of the audience when we have so much other stuff that we're reacting to, particularly at the moment, given all the changes happening in probably any government department at the moment. So when we have these things popping up, there's definitely a very real challenge when trying to integrate it more thoroughly into the risk conversation, and even with other people in other parts of the business. The people's focus are generally on wanting to manage those things that they feel like are right in front of them, and climate risk as it relates to their delivering their services and things like that is quite difficult to reify, I guess. So yeah, it's sort of interesting to hear what different people are approaching with it, because I think it's a challenge for all of us, and I feel like it's the making it real bit that I think is sort of a primary challenge at the moment.
Yeah, that would be a fair statement. Any financial restrictions are making it difficult to get effort in this space.
Yeah, and I think it's quite rare where we have such a new risk that not only is new, but also as regulatory backing, saying we need to consider it, we need to integrate it, we need to do all these other report on it. And I think as a risk profession, these are all quite new things we have to do. So I guess that's why it's useful having conversations and seeing how people are doing it and what good looks like. For example,
it's just in, like, now the OAG's got this guidance on greenwashing and not doing that.
Not doing it, yes.
And so like from like and like I was saying, in terms of making it real, that's something that's more easy to point at, and it's like, are we sure that we're doing the things that we're saying that we're doing, or saying that we want to do, and will we be able to prove it? And that's sort of one way to introduce that into the conversation. But then a lot of that conversation becomes focused on risks related to reputation and relationships, rather than the actual managing the risk related to that climate stuff specifically.
I think that is a good call out, the greenwashing. I mean, the managed fund space has a very real focus, not just in New Zealand but around the world at the moment, from regulators on greenwashing and green hushing and all these other sort of green terms that are popping up. So we, I guess, from an enterprise level, have called out climate change separately, and there's all sorts of arguments over whether it's a root cause to other risks, and
Yes.
Yeah.
it plays out for us. We were an insurer as well, so it's existential for us. So there's some pretty obvious risks around climate change in terms of the physical risk side. But in terms of calling it out as a separate risk, what we try and then do is think about, okay, well, what are the risks that are associated with it explicitly, such as the regulatory risk of the cost burden of just putting climate-related disclosures together. And if we look just at our year 2 reporting, the assurance costs that are associated with it material. So there's sort of financial costs coming through regardless anyway. So there's also litigation risk for us. So there's increasing activism around the world, and there's all sorts of examples of fund managers and other organisations as well being sued by activists and just members for things that people don't like. So and then you've got reputational risk as well, obviously. We've got competitor risk, and you can get sort of quite granular. So we face sort of misalignment of pricing where we might be, for example, underpricing an area prone for flooding, and all other insurers have built that into their pricing. So we end up with a whole lot of extra insured risk in an area that suddenly gets flooded. So things like that. So it sort of becomes quite a deep dive in terms of saying, okay, well, how does climate risk play out for your sector that you operate in, and what are all those sort of associated risks? So rather than looking at it as a root cause itself, say, what are the other risks that it can lead to?
Yeah.
Great point. Thank you.
So are many, like in terms of that deep dive, are many people looking at quantitative ways of assessing like value at risk? Nope.
Yeah, I guess that comes under the climate risk assessment, and it's not it wasn't compulsory this year to do quantification, but it is next year for us. And I think that is what has been highlighted as definitely one of the big key challenges. So has anyone else had, maybe that's a good segue into the risk assessment in general? How, there's a wide range of risks here, both from sea level rise, flooding, all the way through to, changing consumer preferences, changing regulation, litigation. And it's quite an interesting problem. How do you risk assess them? And then secondly, how would you quantify them?
I mean, we're still in a pretty burgeoning phase with all this stuff. Like I was saying before, even though we're subject to these different government-driven initiatives, it's still quite difficult. But the value at risk thing is interesting because we're still quite immature in that sort of space. But there's the whole thing around reputation and things like that. A lot of our customers are, people who are innovating, making new technologies and things like that. And a lot of that is around clean tech and stuff like that. And I sort of don't know if this will ever happen in the future, but it's a risk that I think is kind of interesting. It's like the level to which we might miss out on people wanting to work with us or use our services if we're not seen to be engaging with climate risk in a good way, or managing our climate risks appropriately. Because it's like, if we're supposed to be the innovation agency, but we're sort of not getting amongst it, like how much commercial revenue could we be missing out on that basis is a question that I don't have an answer to, but I think it would be interesting to try and do an assessment and find the answer to that question.
Yeah, so that's a really deep one.
I might jump in and talk about risk assessment. Yeah, so there's some work going on at the moment at a regional level with all the councils to try and kick off a regional risk assessment. And I guess for us as councils, the big worry is what are the climate impacts on our physical assets and also our community, like where, land use planning, where are they based? So it's going to be really interesting. This has been a bit of a long journey to get to this point, but it is, it's going to be an interesting time, I think. There's a bit of talk around how exactly that risk assessment gets rolled out. We've referred to the MFE guidance, but I think from what I understand across other councils, sort of engaging the likes of Tonkin and Taylor Rebecca seems to be the common way of doing the actual work, although very expensive and also very long timeframes on it. So trying to see what we can get at least an initial cut done for now.
I'd be tempted to say that if you engage Tonkin and Taylor, you probably get a similar risk assessment methodology that they've already prepared for the likes of Auckland Council and some other groups as well, which I think the council originally had done in 2022, and then earlier this year when the new group climate risk specialist was hired, they put together a framework for the group to use, which just kind of tightened up that methodology a wee bit and made it more applicable to us. It is a lot more detailed than, of course, our standard risk assessments that we do, which you've no doubt seen, looking at exposure and vulnerability and so on over likelihood and consequence. We've only done qualitative assessments on that so far, and yeah, I think quantitative will start later this year, which will be fun.
Yeah, no, that's good to know.
Yeah, I guess consultants have a role to play in this, and what role have they played in risk assessments? Has it been in guiding the whole risk assessment or climate-related disclosures? Has it been focused on physical risk? Has it been focused on physical transitional risks? There's a few different angles, and depends on who you contact and what skill set they have and what resources you have. Yeah. So I can share our. I guess we contracted someone last year to help us at more that broad level, and the broad level being, let's look at help guide us through the risk assessment process as a whole. And so that, left us the following year or FY24 with a problem about, okay, what do we do now? How do we look at things more deeply? Do we just slightly update for what happened last year? And we went down the route of, I guess, preparing for quantification and preparing and laying some groundwork to test out different methodologies on how we could approach the problem. And we came up with 3 broad approaches. I guess firstly is, utilizing the risk matrix and, effectively plotting things on the risk matrix as per usual, and then reading off the corresponding financial value. And I guess the second approach was more, a second approach would be more expert elicitation or talking to subject matter experts in the business and leading them through a process to kind of estimate in financial terms what a big loss could be, what a small loss could be, and kind of teasing that out to come up with a risk quantification. And I think the third approach would be more, I guess, a physics or modeling or climate change modeling type approach, For example, you get flood data, you translate flood data into exposure for your assets, you translate that into how much damage it costs, flowing through to how much disruption it would lead to, and then that flows through to the financial impact. So what I've found very interesting is if, when we lay out those 3 different approaches to quantification, is how they apply to the different risks. And with that, what you'll end up with some risks that are driven largely from, a good bit of research, a good bit of science, a good bit of modeling, for flooding, for example. But then you'll have other risks such as litigation or reputation or changing consumer demand, which are quite the other end of the spectrum. You can't really point to much science. Yes, there's analysis, but it's quite a different approach. And I think that will take a lot of getting used to, the kind of practicality and the natural imbalance between how you quantify such a vast range of risks.
Yeah, and some of it comes into impacts on communities and less tangible things than finance, which is hard to then build into the models.
Mm.
Yeah, I think we're all like, any of us who do this kind of stuff are always keen to try and quantify as best as we possibly can, and cost is probably one of the I'm cautious about using the word easiest, but it's one of the things that's easier for people to understand from like that to get decision makers to pay attention to, I suppose. But I mean, how with all these, like with the consultant engagements and things like that you've done, and knowing what you know now about like your climate related risk, like how have you found decision maker engagement with that? Because I think like with consultant engagements, like they can be very useful, but then once the consultant engagement is finished, and then it's up to those of us left behind to sort of carry out or help support the implementation of whatever information's been developed. That's sort of where I think the challenge actually starts, because it's nice to have graphs and pages of stuff that give you a lot of good information, but yeah, I know that this isn't my webinar or anything, but I would like, from your experience.
Please share.
No, just from your experiences, like
Yeah.
how have you found getting across this stuff, particularly to boards and things, particularly where you've used consultant driven assessments and things?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. One is what's it called? Credibility. Consultants give good credibility, which can be communicated well to boards. There is some benefit with that. I guess the disadvantages I've found is the in-house capability doesn't grow. This is something that we need to do every year, and the decision needs to be made. Do we increase capability so we can understand it and communicate it and integrate it? Or do we kind of outsource it a little bit more? I guess from my experience that it was quite interesting, because they took a very climate variable changing approach, looking at all the climate variables, say look at rain and go, oh, this area is going to have more rain, this area is going to have less rain, and draw a lot of inference from that. So you're making the basic assumption is, the rain changes by 10%, therefore flooding will increase by 10%, when it may or may not.
Yeah.
And then you go you take that same extrapolation and you run it for something like litigation, and you go, it becomes very very hard, and I think that caused a little bit of, not mistrust, but it was harder to integrate it or see it related to the risks that we face, when you separate it out into like climate changing and risk changing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess we're literally in that conversation at the moment around, how shall we approach, what's that balance between building in-house capability and using external consultants, and which part of the risk assessment is best focused, and where we got to was probably physical risks and deal with transitional risks in-house.
Yeah, because I feel like it's up to us in-house to be able to take it and then be like, okay, this is what you're supposed to do with this information. But when a lot of us are sort of developing capability and that's where a lot of our challenge, I think, is coming from. I say our challenge is if there's like a big team of us. There's one person who does sustainability and I'm the only risk person. So
Yeah.
when I say our, I mean like just a couple of us, but it's something that like sort of keeps me up, is always trying to make sure that like if we're delivering information that it's like adding value to the decision making. And I think I'm always wary of muddying the waters and making sure that anything that we're saying is actually going to add value to the decision making. But because it's such a like quote unquote new risk, I think that's where a lot of our challenges, which is why we're so desperate to integrate it more thoroughly into the actual enterprise risk profile.
Yep, most definitely.
Yeah, my experience from what I've seen is I'd agree that outsourcing some of the more detailed, gritty work around looking at a physical impact of a hazard on assets or changes in the environment is useful because it's quite a bit of work and it otherwise doesn't get done if it's left to in-house staff because of competing demands. But you're absolutely right. Then taking that information and using it to tell a story that the organization cares about requires the knowledge of the people in the business. And if that's not done well, you can have all the best insight from scientific investigation, but it will still not hit the mark in terms of recognizing and making changes to delivery models or services or allocation of resources to address the problems that might have been identified. We see that all the time at council. You can have all sorts of good reports done, but if the story around what it means is not communicated in a more accessible way for the councillors as elected members and why they should care, they'll quite often not really absorb the impact of the technical well enough to make a call.
I was looking at some sea level rise data put over our critical assets recently, and I think it was at 0.25 meters of sea level rise, something, it was like 1 point something % of our critical assets would be impacted. And I mentioned that to our head of strategy and planning, and he said, well, yes, that's correct, but it's also correct that there's a community of 300 people who we'd have to retreat from and remove their wastewater services at that level. So you can say it's only 1 point something % if you like, but we could also say we're going to be responsible for communities not having wastewater services and what that might mean for them. I was like, okay.
And how do you quantify that risk?
Yeah, those become big scary numbers, and that's one of the, like the greenwashing thing, one of the things I find you have to be careful here is the cry wolf factor, that some of those extrapolations could become exceptionally big numbers. But then some people do disengage with that even more, going, oh, that's just, sometime in the future and very distant and not something we have to deal with now. So that's one of, I think, the challenges of quantification too, is putting it into context.
I was wondering about you, Dan Callahan. You got lots of risk. You mentioned thousands. Oh, sorry, thousands of investments or something. How did you tackle kind of just a sheer number and kind of assessing the risks for them?
We relied on every exemption we could for the first year.
Year two, right? It gets challenging.
The data is an enormous challenge, and we unfortunately need to buy in the data and as do pretty much all fund managers, and you become you start learning a lot about the different ways data can be sort of cut, and it's interesting you guys are all talking about quantification, right? Because it's our job as a fund manager then to try and source that quantification per security that we invest in, and and then somehow aggregated up into some meaningful number for an end user or an investor, where the reality is it's done at a point in time, and we could go out tomorrow and sell every single security and buy 2,000 new securities. So at a sort of listed company level, there are data aggregators and suppliers out there. So MSCI, Sustainalytics, and Morningstar tend to, there's a bunch of companies that'll pull data together for you and sell it to you at a cost, which is yet just another cost that somehow needs to be worked into the system, right? So the challenges you find from our perspective is not just the data and the quality of the data, but also the fact that data is can be different for the same organization depending on what source you go to for that data. And usually the reason for that is the currency of the data. So if data has been sourced from annual reports, for example, one data provider might have used the most recent report and somebody else might have used a report from a year before, something like that. So you start getting inconsistencies even if you're comparing apples with apples. The real challenge with all of this stuff is it's the same with any risk, really, is at the end of the day, as much as we'd like to quantify our risks down to the nth degree and sort of build our risk models and build our sort of heat maps around some true quantification of a risk, there's vast levels of subjectivity to all of this stuff, and so it's just hard. And I guess these are some of the just challenges you need to work through. I guess just one other thing, just on the use of consultants versus in-house. I mean, absolutely agree with everything that was said. Probably the one extra one for us, we went down the path of doing it ourselves last year. We failed to appreciate just how much work it was, and what that does is it sucks capacity out of your business. So we're considering using some external resource for completion of this year, just because the amount of stuff that didn't get done, that sort of fell behind, was quite material. So it becomes your classic sort of trade-off. Do you use a consultant to give you not just the capability but also the capacity? So that's the other sort of thing to think about as well.
Do you think, with all this talk about data, are risk people skilled enough in that area? You know, I think for lots of people it could be a little bit uncomfortable or outside the norm of what risk people have done in the past. Any thoughts on that statement? Is it outrageous or could be true?
I mean, look, I'll be honest. I personally struggle with data, which is why I have a business analyst, data analyst person who helps with those types of things. But they're also pulled in a lot of different directions. But they helped with the climate related disclosure and carbon reporting stuff. And without them, I think from an in-house perspective, we'd definitely be in trouble. It's probably an area I say probably, to be honest, yes, it's an area that I think I, as a risk person, needs to develop. And I can't obviously speak for other people, but I think a lot of us are pretty comfortable with measuring things in grey and like
with words.
Yeah, like what was being said before, right? About there's a lot of subjectivity, so we wrap a lot of frameworks around things to try and make that subjectivity discernible and easier to sort of decode for the audience. But I think ultimately data and graphs and pictures just will make people feel like the information has more authority, and that's where the context for that data becomes so important. And I think that's where, even if we don't have strong data capabilities, that's where our value can really sort of be more greatly demonstrated. The trouble is, of course, is then if you get stuck in this place where you're adding multiple paragraphs of disclaimer about what the graph they're about to look like and what it means in context, that also doesn't necessarily help breed any confidence. And we're always being asked, so what, right? So what? So why are you showing me this? What's the point of this? What do you want me to do? Or what should we be doing? Well, I suppose that would depend on the capability of your leadership, right? But yeah, I think if there was an area that could probably use some upskilling, I think for myself, like I say, I can't speak for anyone else, but for myself as a risk person, that ability to take data and interpret it against our enterprise risk and operational context and make sure that it's being translated in a way to leaders that they can actually have trust and confidence that the information we're providing them is actually something they can use to make decisions against. So if anything ever does go wrong, they can point back and like, well, this is what we had. This is why we made the decision we made.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's that enough detail to tell the story with a level of confidence that it can stand a little bit of rigor. But I think you're right. Need to be really careful that presenting numbers doesn't then try to create more credibility or robustness than the underlying model inherently has. So that is a danger that I think you're right needs to be avoided. And that idea of translating the grey into something more tangible, understandable rather than maybe tangible is really the key message there, that should only be helping to tell the story and give people a sense of magnitude than actual specific fortune telling the future.
Yeah. Avoiding fortune telling or pretending like we can fortune tell, I think.
Yeah.
I think sometimes data can give the impression that that's exactly what we're doing, and it's like, well, hang on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to jump off. Got a 1 o'clock meeting to go, but it's been quite good chat and just insight into some of the more specific challenges and ideas that we might need to have a think about on the way through this.
Thanks for your contribution, Regan.
Thanks, Regan.
Cheers, guys. Talk soon.
Any other comments on that data point in terms of do risk is it an area of upskilling required for risk professionals?
Yeah, sorry, I
Hey, Mark.
had to take a separate call while I've been on this, so
Yeah.
I hope. In the absence of our expert, Pete Taylor, who's travelling around Europe at the moment, we're lucky to have such an expert in that field, and we're guided by him. He's led the production of the first disclosure that we've needed to do under our financial services legislation, and his modelling provides the basis for our risk assessments and quantification. So at a future date, it would be great to have him perhaps talk again to RiskNZ and members about a bit more detailed background. But to your question, I think risk managers absolutely, like technology or other complex areas, are reliant on the experts and gathering that information in layman's terms, which can be then processed and assessed again in layman's terms and reported in a language that everyone can understand, so the risks are synthesized and understood. So, as a risk manager, I'm very much reliant on Pete as the expert, but through talking it through and articulation, we can all be on the same page.
Thanks, Mark. Is there anything else about, I guess, the risk assessment itself that anyone would like to raise a discussion point about?
Does everyone kind of have a separate methodology established for the climate related risk assessments as opposed to their standard, what they might have in their enterprise risk framework? Or
We kind of developed one for our climate related reporting, and that kind of iterated back to improving our regular enterprise level reporting. So it's forced us to improve how we do things, or make them more make more guidelines, or make more of a process around it, because it's a bit different when you have something you're going to do every year. So having it has forced us to document the process, and by documenting it, we took guidance from XRB, took guidance from other things, and kind of made a really good process. And then that's circled back towards going, hey, where can this apply? We've used these impact pathways, we've used scenario analysis. Oh, great, we can have some more general guidance for scenario analysis now. So it's been quite good in that respect. It's forced a little bit of a maturity increase around the business, whether it's just been documenting, or whether it's been, looking at the great guidance from XRB and going, oh, there's some great points here. We'll integrate them in other areas.
Okay, cool.
I guess the use of scenario analysis is probably the area in terms of methodology or tools that we're using quite specifically around climate related sort of discovery and risk assessment that we're not really using in other areas. So from that regard, it's probably by virtue of almost being forced upon us, perhaps giving us an opportunity to lift maturity in how we assess risk. And from that, there's the potential that we haven't really looked at using, to be honest, as a way of assessing other risks across our business. So that'd be my takeaway. Probably the other thing, and I'm not sure how ingrained it is in other areas, but certainly I know some industry levels, so there's been essentially collaborative workshops to create industry level risk assessments, which have then been used to just create a consistency for comparison points across whatever that industry might be. So that's probably the other thing where it's perhaps played out in the climate related disclosure regime in terms of a methodology for assessing risk.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, we've got some we've got our scenarios, and then our method for doing the physical climate related risks at this stage, for our standard business and operational risk, we stick by a 5x5 likelihood and consequence. For our physical climate related risks, we're doing assessing an asset's sensitivity and adaptive capacity to get vulnerability, and then also looking at its exposure at each of the scenarios, exposure and vulnerability, then a kind of like our likelihood of damage, which then goes against the impact or consequence to get our final sort of inherent risk rating, which will do our mitigation responses and then have a residual rating. And I'm kind of nervous that we are either increasing our maturity, or we've perhaps got something that a lot of the business don't want to engage in because of how many steps and its complexity. But I don't quite know how to tackle that. I think it's just a matter of having to raise everyone's maturity and engaging with risk to tackle that.
Sounds easy.
Yeah.
Hi,
Go
hey
ahead.
Ben. Hi everyone. I joined late. I'm James Hughes, and I do quite a bit in the risk area around climate, and I guess my observations are that there's a lot of confusion around how to think about climate risk over different time horizons, how to link risk to scenario planning, which isn't immediately obvious. And Todd, your comment around we kind of use a blended approach between IPCC language and ISO language. I would comment that everyone's using different methods everywhere I've seen. Do risks inform your scenarios, or do the scenarios inform risks?
Who knows?
Good question. And there's also a strong view that using the word likelihood is incorrect conceptually in climate, because all scenarios are plausible, therefore they've all got equal likelihood. So that all these things are really messy. So yeah, I mean, we use a method quite similar, Todd, to what we would recommend using a method that's similar to what you've just set out, where you would, for direct physical risks, you can look at exposure, vulnerability, made up of sensitivity and adaptive capacity elements, and importantly, bring in, for an organization, the consequence table that you would normally use. So you're kind of doing if you wanted to frame it as likelihood and consequence, I like your language of likelihood of damage or something, but you're being cautious about that. However, for indirect risks, you're sort of say the risk of a supply chain interruption affecting your business. Well, there is no exposure or sensitivity really components to that. So you've got to treat your indirect risks, I think, quite differently to your direct and separate those out. If someone said we want to rate our indirect risk, I say, well, you can look at the consequence of that playing out and maybe use that, but there's not really any way to look at the other parameters, in my opinion. And similarly for transition risks, they get quite tricky as well. So yeah, I'll stop there, but that's our experience.
I was going to say, so far my way around this has been not looking at any indirect or transition risks as yet.
Good approach.
But we've got to obviously, and I think for transition risks, the idea was to do something similar but drop exposure. And yeah, there's going to be a bit of head banging when it comes to indirect risks.
I mean, you can justify that, right? I reckon you could say under different scenarios, if we're assuming these scenarios all have equal likelihood, then you're saying that's a 1 in your equation. So really you're interested in the consequence. If this plays out under this scenario, then the consequence is X, and that's a proxy for risk. You could take that view and,
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and also when you look at the typical likelihood scale on a risk matrix, it's doesn't go out to 2100. If you start including such a time frame, which is not typically used in business, it kind of makes it can make things. Yeah, the likelihood concept kind of is hard to understand a bit more, I find. Or it brings it down to a rare event, which kind of also doesn't make sense.
I think the way to do that, Ben, or way to get around that, is that you need to assess risk over, say, for example, at 3 different time horizons under different scenarios. So you can imagine your traffic light risk rating. You've got 5 of them. In our example, you have a present day. You've got a mid-century under, say, a moderate and an extreme climate scenario, and you've got an end of century under a moderate and extreme scenario. So you've got a risk view that goes from green moving to orange, moving to red over time, for example. So that it removes the need to try and deal with all that time horizon complexity in one box, right? So you've got 5 boxes or 3 or however you want to do it. That's how and the advantage of that is you can see the risks that are higher rated earlier in time, and that's, you might have stuff that, based on its sensitivity or the exposure, is a flashing red light currently or in mid-century, or from a transition perspective it might be in the next 5 or 10 years. Yeah.
Just seeing your question there, James. Would you like to elaborate on it, or just share it with the group? We have developed methods based on blended IP. Yeah, I think you shared that, right?
Oh, sorry, that was really what I wasn't quite sure if I was speaking or not, but yeah, it's like we're saying. So you've got the IPCC has the exposure sensitivity, adaptive capacity kind of language, and so I think it's really important to add to that your organisational consequences, because that's basically the measure by which it's material or not. So that doesn't exist. So it's kind of, Todd, I quite like that language you used earlier. Yeah.
Sorry, that with that time scaling you were talking about, how have you found the receptivity of organisations when looking at timescales so far out into the future?
So it's a good question. When you're talking, so it's probably a two-part answer. The physical risks remain relatively, or the physical climate projections, if you're looking at SSPs or the RCP scenarios, they're pretty tight together until mid-century, and then they really diverge. So you get quite a divergent view over the long term, because your SSP 3-7 or whichever the high-end one is, really high in terms of different climate parameters. But at mid-century, they're not that distinctive, because things haven't really, they are, but not to the same degree as you get at end of century. So your physical risks play out quite differently to your transition risks, and your transition risks are really those imminent ones. Transition risks are going to play out in the next 10 years or the next 20 years, so they're really short term. And so we kind of got two different time horizons for the different risk types. Organizations, yes, I agree, they really struggle. We've had some, I work for Conklin & Taylor, so we've had some clients who say have long-lived assets, and they're, for example, a port or a council or a property company, or less so much a property company, but yeah, that definitely have a ambition and a receptive to look at the longer term. But many, they turn their portfolio over, or whatever business they're in, over pretty quickly. So those longer term time horizons aren't of that much interest, and so much can change, especially in the transition area. And we sort of argue there's actually not that much value in thinking about transition past mid-century anyway, because anything could happen, right? So it becomes just I don't know if it's an interesting discussion. Does it?
No, yeah, that's really useful, because that's been part of the challenge that I sort of didn't mention before, but I'm glad that you brought it up, because that's part of the challenge with the climate risk stuff in general for us has been when we are talking in potentially long periods of time, it can be very difficult when so much of the focus on risk is around what is happening right now. And I mean, like, it's kind of funny to think, though, because like there's some buildings on our site that are nearly a century old, but we still can't imagine them having like we struggle to think that far into the future, particularly as it relates to risk. And I sort of, while you were saying that, I was sort of thinking in my head, I wonder what it would be like to pose this type of assessment to leadership and, say, the board, with things looking at the next half century, and probably struggling with getting that across. So but I like to hear about where that's been successful, because I think it's good to hear that people are able to think in those terms, especially when you get so used to people thinking about the immediate sort of, like, even 1 to 3 years can be a challenge sometimes. So
I'll just kind of wind back a comment I said a little bit earlier around scenarios being equally as likely. Maybe this helps with people kind of communicating this. You could probably justifiably, and I personally have this view, that the likelihood of us transitioning at to the degree that XRB, like the 1.5 scenario, is very slim. And even if you look at the commitments made by all countries under their nationally determined contributions, those are commitments. They're not actions committed. Even if they honour their commitments, we're still at about 2.7 degrees, 2.9, which is a mid-range SSP to 4.5. So that's a significant degree of warming. So to your point, you could argue it's pretty likely, without maybe being formal about that word, that we're going to get significant degrees of warming, and that's changes in rainfall of this nature. This is sea level rise of we've already baked in sort of 400 millimeters. That's given, right? And so I think sea level rise of in addition in advance of 400 millimeters plus. So I think communicating this, we've probably got to, when I communicate it, I'm probably using language that's a little bit more, I don't know what the adjective is, alarmist or realistic or whatever, and saying, look, the chances of us transitioning, we're not seeing much action, so we're going to get warming. So that probably lends people to go, okay, this map that shows us inundation of half a metre plus of sea level rise, maybe that's something we should actually be planning about, rather than thinking about it as another uncertainty that may or may not happen. That was a bit of a ramble, but does that?
That was good.
Yeah, because it's that for me, part of it's been that struggle between like the idea of it being an existential threat versus something that is as real as like another different kind of health and safety hazard.
That's right. Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah. I thought one other area I'd like to touch on is just adaptation planning. What has that been progressed? And what's your approach to it? I know at Fonterra where we work, we have a number of initiatives that could be considered adaptation planning, but what's happening is this new standard is really putting a little bit more formality around documenting them and describing them in that sort of aspect. And that also another it's not required in the standard FY24, but FY25 it's starting to creep in. So I was just wondering if anyone's kind of produced much in that space already.
From an insurer perspective, I mean, there's a clear and obvious trend to risk-based pricing. The data is becoming more granular. The bigger insurers are now doing it at a basically your house address level. So the issue is that there is a necessary need for some sort of government, local government, insurers, private sector collaboration around all this, because the insurers have the ability to just say, no, we're not going to insure an asset anymore. Now that leads to levels of vulnerabilities where people are reliant on insurance to maintain their mortgage or get a mortgage. It causes all sorts of issues at a local council level if the insurers aren't insuring property. There's the data element where there needs to be some sort of sharing of data potentially in terms of forming a national database of planes or whatever it might be. So my view is that I'll probably take the fairly pessimistic view as well. I mean, we've already over the last year been above 1.5 global temperature averages is pre-industrial levels. So we're definitely heading towards more rain, more flooding, and so I almost see this being something that'll come through regulations and requirements. But there's all sorts of issues. Nobody wants to tackle it. That's the problem.
Mm.
I might just add in, so yeah, Hastings District Council. So we've obviously had pretty significant impact from the cyclone, which is, I suppose, almost caused adaptation planning enforced by regional councils' land categorisation almost. So that's been quite interesting, but it is such a emotive and I guess almost politicised environment to be in. And yeah, it's an interesting one, and I think we're certainly seeing some decisions coming that, talk about insurance responses to premiums going up. What are we actually going to prioritise insuring versus self-insuring, or not replacing if the worst did happen? So yeah, it's an interesting space, I think, for us at the moment.
Interesting. Did you call all the after Cyclone Gabrielle? Was that kind of called climate change adaptation planning, or was it not?
No, it hasn't been. It's been it's been termed land categorization. So there's 1, 2, and 3 category 1, 2, 3. But it's, I suppose it is in a sense adaptation planning, given that they're trying to remove people and property from places where it's thought that it will go again, and particularly areas, I suppose, where the regional councils trying to look at their stop bank repairs and what are they actually going to pay the money to get up to a higher degree of protection for the predictions that there are.
Okay.
I just add a couple of comments, Ben, that I think from an adaptation planning perspective, there's kind of two parts to it. One is adaptation for communities and that live in hazard zones, and then there's the other, if you're a business building an adaptation plan internally, that's quite a different context, right? So it's mitigating your risks in essence. The community side, as Steffi was saying, and others will know, the government's in the middle of an inquiry at the moment. There's been various papers come out, managed expert working groups. It is probably the extreme end of complex issues, because it comes down to, I think, how you deal with private property ownership and the rights to enjoy something that is deemed to be in a risk zone. The concept of risk for a community, how do you determine what is high risk and on what basis? And then the last one that's been thrown into these various documents is how do you think about risk tolerance? And whose tolerance? Is it a community risk tolerance, or is it an individual's? And those are, really interesting areas. And will the government choose to take an approach that gives communities a say in their level of risk tolerance, versus will the government set some standards to say, in this hazard zone of a 1 in X return period event, then certain activities can or can't occur. So you've got this, various approaches that will be interesting to see how they go.
Yeah, I was saying to someone recently, it sometimes feels like a little bit of a Mexican standoff of, like, as a local council, we're waiting for central government to do something, but it just feels like, everyone sort of doesn't want to be the bearer of bad news or the decision, and it gets really quite challenging.
Yeah, and there's a lot of these new challenges around at the moment, and I guess the next one on the horizon I thought I quickly asked about is nature risk, and it's your, was it TFND, or it could be another cab off the rank for disclosure. I'm just wondering if anyone has started to explore that add another complexity to the risk profession and sustainability. Have you seen anything like that, James, in your around people you've discussed with?
Yeah, you're right in that it's the next big thing. I think climate and nature are so linked that from nature-based solutions or from carbon sequestration, it'll be interesting to see how that comes together. I think people have got enough on their plate and a lot of fatigue at the moment around the climate stuff.
Yes,
That
yes.
this nature piece is important, but yeah, I'm watching with interest to see how fast it takes off. I do know people will probably maybe closer to it than I am, but the government's making noises about toning down some of the climate disclosure stuff, whether that's direct liabilities or who knows if it might go even further. So, yeah, I don't know. Things go in different directions. I know that from a market perspective, there's, everyone, I was at the climate conference last week in Auckland, Climate and Business, as some of you probably were. A lot of emphasis has been put on our trading partners and big organizations who buy our products demanding this stuff. So it's the Nestle's, etc., are requiring it. So it will happen irrespective. Yeah, that's probably all I can add there, Ben.
Cool. Was there any, I guess, final thoughts or final questions anyone would like to share before we end the call today? Has it been useful? Has it answered questions or kind of any feedback around?
Definitely useful.
around it
Thank
too?
you, Ben. It's nice to talk to other people about this rather than just sitting alone trying to figure it out. So
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just always interesting to hear about what other people are sort of experiencing with these types of things, and just hearing about the different ways people are trying to address it. And it's also good to hear that you're not just the only one who's having similar sorts of everyone's having similar sorts of challenges. It's not like you're alone in the woods, which is quite good.
Oh, great. Cool. So I guess if there's nothing, I'll go away and I'll try and write up these points and get some kind of learnings around, where things are at and what challenges we'll see forward. And then I guess the next step would be to say, is there a role, what role could Risk New Zealand play in this? Maybe it's around helping people upskill in some areas, as we highlighted, or maybe it's in sharing a bit more broadly some different approaches for managing these risks. But it was really good to hear people's views, and thank you for participating. I know it's always a bit of a challenge in these types of forums and with all the other difficulties and being over lunchtime. So really appreciate your involvement, and I got a lot out of it as well. So thank you for your time.